From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. We're coming to you tonight with some breaking news. The Supreme Court ruling just a few moments ago that it will allow President Trump to oust an official of the National Labor Relations Board and from the U.S. Merit Systems Protection Board for now, while a legal fight goes forward.
The court's saying the president, quote, may remove without cause executive officers who exercise that power on his behalf, unquote. It's a suit playing out in the Supreme Court that we've been following here for months now, and its broader implications for federal officers. One important caveat we're learning from the court's decision, important for our audience on Bloomberg. This ruling does not apply to the chair of the Federal Reserve, Jay Powell, who the president has repeatedly criticized while saying that he has no intention of firing him, at least most recently. We're covering that big news for you tonight and more, including the crucial way forward for President Trump's tax bill. For the latest on this now, we turn to Bloomberg's Kate Davidson with us live in Washington. Kate, what does this decision mean for Powell as we hear from the court about the uniquely structured entity that is the Federal Reserve?
Yes. So, I mean, I'm sure that it's a sigh of relief for the Fed, although if you were listening to Jay Powell last month, he was speaking in Chicago, and he actually said, he sort of predicted this and said that he was confident or had a feeling that the Supreme Court would kind of create some sort of exemption or at least make clear, rather, that the law treats the Fed differently. And that's exactly what they did today. They said that the Fed, it just did not apply to the Fed because of their unique structure, and they're referred to them as a quasi-private entity, which is true. I mean, the Fed was established by Congress, but there are 12 regional reserve banks that are run by private boards of directors. The Fed board, that is the officials that presumably this ruling would apply to, they are nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. But the law says they can't be removed. They can only be removed for cause. So there was some question about whether the president had the power to remove them. The Fed has previously said, and presumably have had their lawyers look very closely at this, that they can't be fired. So the Supreme Court seems to have agreed with that position today.
So even if the Fed is insulated, knowing that this legal fight still has to play out in full, the justices aren't necessarily saying that the president definitively has this power. They're just allowing him to exercise it for now as these other court challenges play out. Are there implications for other agencies beyond the Fed, other regulators?
It certainly seems that way. I mean, as you said, it's a stay. It's a temporary decision. We'll have to see what the final outcome is. We saw that there were a few liberal justices that dissented from this, but clearly the direction that the court is headed seems to be that they're somewhat sympathetic to this argument that the president has this power. But that's the worry, right? That this could have much farther-reaching implications than just for these two agencies.
All right. Bloomberg's Kate Davidson running to us with breaking news. Thank you so much. And we'll be returning to this story throughout the program tonight. But now we turn to today's major win for the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, passing President Trump's one big beautiful bill with the narrowest of margins, claiming victory in a 215 to 214 vote this morning after making concessions overnight in a bid to get hardline fiscal conservatives on board. But the tax bill could still add trillions of dollars to the deficit, exacerbating bond investors' concerns about the ballooning debt. We'll get into the Treasury market's reaction with Romaine Bostick coming up ahead. But we start with Bloomberg's Eric Wasson, who's live on Capitol Hill. So, Eric, the House was one animal. The Senate, where it goes next, is entirely another.
That's right. In the Senate, it's designed to be the sauce that cools the cup of tea, and it's going to plan to play that role. We talked to John Thune, the majority leader. He says a July 4th date that's been talked about, been bandied about by Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is aspirational. It's tenuous. The Senate's going to take its time. The first step is to examine provisions in the House bill that are regulatory, that are policy, that are not fiscal in nature. There's a lot of them in there, whether it's AI regulations, deregulating gun silencers, et cetera. There's a gamut of things that were put into the bill to appease various factions in the House that just won't fly in the Senate. The Senate says that budget bills have to be about budgetary matters. That's the first hurdle to climb. Then we've got the issue of, changes. Mike Crapo talked to my colleague Steve Dennis this morning saying he's going to try to make as many of the tax cuts permanent as possible. Many of them are temporary, including taxes on no taxes on tips and overtime. I talked to Jim Justice of West Virginia. He says he wants those permanent. This will all add to the price tag. If you add to the price tag, then you've got to go back to the deficit hawks and find spending cuts. If you find spending cuts, that might anger the moderates. So it's going to be a very difficult dance for Thune to get this through. I'm expecting by the August recess, but that brings us up against the debt ceiling deadline, which the bill is being used to address.
Indeed, the debt limit is looming over all of this. Bloomberg's Eric Wasson live on Capitol Hill. Thank you for the latest, Eric. For more on the next steps, as we turn to the Senate now, we bring in Rohit Kumar, principal co-leader of National Tax Office at PwC Washington and former Deputy Chief of Staff to Mitch McConnell. Rohit, it's great to have you back here. You know what comes next, not just the bird bath, but as Eric just mentioned, some pretty big changes. And when you hear John Thune talking about a very active discussion still surrounding Medicaid, for instance, what are the first things that senators are going to want to pull out of this bill?
Yeah, so look, certainly on the tax side, there are a couple things that leap off the page at me where you expect the Senate to make, or I expect the Senate to make changes. One, and Eric kind of referenced this, making some of the temporary provisions permanent. I think their focus is going to initially be on some of the business provisions, the tax treatment of R&D, the interest limitation rule, bonus depreciation. All of those are 5-year extensions in the House bill. I could see the Senate wanting to invest the time and money to make those extensions permanent. Probably item 2 is Inflation Reduction Act. The House went pretty aggressively at phasing out on an aggressive timetable of phasing out those incentives. I think senators are going to be a little bit more moderate in their appetite there, and give a little bit more time for existing projects to continue and for perhaps new projects to come online. So I think that's an area where there's clearly going to be some friction between the House and the Senate. And then last but not least is the individual SALT cap, both the amount of the increase, which generally speaking, Senate Republicans were not interested in a higher cap, but equally, and I think this has not been widely covered or well reported, but I think it will matter, especially to perhaps viewers here. There is embedded in that a tax increase on pass-throughs of a certain type and variety. Those that don't get the new in 2017 pass-through deduction. So think, dental practices, doctors' offices, small accounting firms, places like that. They are losing the ability to deduct their state and local income tax, or not just income, state and local tax payments across the board. It's partly how they're financing the increase in the individual cap overall. But if I'm a Senate Republican and I didn't really feel pressure to increase that cap in the first place, I'm super not interested in raising taxes on small and medium-sized businesses in my state to help finance that. So I think that's a third area of contention, and one that I think is a little bit of a sleeper issue. It's only really emerged on my radar screen in the last probably 72 hours.
Well, and we appreciate you bringing our attention to that. What about the carried interest loophole that obviously wasn't part of the House legislation, but we've heard some rumblings about in the Senate?
Yeah, well, look, this thing is only in play to the extent that the president sort of insists that's in play. Senate Republicans, House Republicans will point to the 2017 change, and that's the only change that's been made of any recent vintage to the tax treatment of carry. House and Senate Democrats tried, but couldn't get it across the finish line. And the other piece of this is mostly politics. The amount of revenue implicated here is like rounding error money as it relates to the U.S. government. It sounds like a lot of money, and it would be a lot of money to me or you or anyone probably watching. But as to the government, it's just not a significant amount of money. And so this just becomes a political question. It's not really a revenue question. It's not going to pay for an expanded child tax credit or really anything of significance.
We heard from the Speaker of the House, Rohit, after the passage of the bill this morning. I want to get to the timeline with you. Here's what Mike Johnson said about his hopes and expectations for what comes next.
Consideration of this once-in-a-generation legislation, we stand ready to continue our work together to deliver on the one big, beautiful bill, as President Trump named it himself. We're going to send that to his desk. We're going to get it there by Independence Day on July 4th, and we are going to celebrate a new golden age in America.
Aggressive, Rohit, by the 4th of July, or realistic?
Aggressively realistic. Look, I'm rooting for them. I would love for this to be done by the 4th of July as much as they would. But Congress does not have a tremendous history of turning in its homework early. And the deadline for turning in the homework is really the debt limit, which Secretary Bessent has said we will cross the Rubicon at some point in the month of August, which means really end of July, first week of August. That's the real sort of deadline for getting something done. And so it wouldn't shock me if the Senate passed a bill by the 4th of July. That would not be a shocking development. But getting it all the way to the president's desk, again, while I am rooting for them with every fiber of my being, if I were planning, I would be planning more for mid to end of July rather than 4th of July.
So maybe August recess is the real deadline we're working with here. We'll have to find out. But Rohit, obviously Republicans are, whenever they do this, they're selling this as a win for the American people who at the very least won't see a tax hike. because of this legislation. But for the average American, what can they actually expect in terms of a difference in their wallet when we get to the next tax year?
Yeah, Kaylee, you raise an important point. I mean, politically, sometimes it's hard to message, we stop this bad thing from happening that you may not have even known was about to happen, right? Because you're not, so focused on expiration dates and the such. They will certainly try to message that aggressively, but there are some improvements in the regime that are retroactive to the beginning of 2025 that should show up on people's 2020 returns that they file in early 2026. An expansion of the child tax credit, no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, interest-free, or not interest-free, deduction for auto loan interest on qualifying American-made vehicles, and no tax on Social Security for seniors, which is done through a proxy by an increase in the standard deduction. So there are some benefits for selected taxpayers, but the child tax credit, for example, that's a pretty broad universe of taxpayers. They'll get the additional $500 child tax credit. So those are the things that would be kind of new that people will see. But it is the vast majority of this, and the vast majority of the revenue implicated here is simply preventing the significant tax increase that would have hit every W-2 wage earner in the country in 2026 had some action not been taken.
House Republicans who've joined us today are celebrating cutting $1 trillion in spending, they tell us, Rohit. But the CBO says this will still add $2.4 trillion to the debt over the next 10 years, to the national debt. Will there be any effort by this Republican leadership on Capitol Hill to try to get to debt and deficits now that this is done?
There may be ongoing efforts. This has been a topic of ongoing debate. This has been going on since before I started working on Capitol Hill. The challenge is twofold. First off, the big drivers of our debt and deficits long term are the entitlement programs, and President Trump has made it pretty clear that he's not interested in taking a serious review of Medicare or Social Security spending. And if you're not talking about those things, it's hard to be having a serious conversation about the size of the national debt. And at some level, I understand it, because the choices you have to make to deal with the national debt are profoundly unpopular. You've got to raise more revenue. You got to cut spending. That's it. And the public isn't really going to tolerate that unless they see it as in service of avoiding a greater harm. So until the national debt is a thing that an average member of the public, as they're going to the voting booth, is thinking about, until it reaches that level of, saliency for the typical voter, Congress is not going to have the political license it needs to make the hard choices, which are, again, they're really only two. More money in, less money out.
All right, Rohit Kumar, principal and co-leader of National Tax Office at PwC Washington, thank you so much for joining us. And still ahead, the action the Trump administration is now taking against Harvard University and the impact it could have on tens of thousands of international students. But up next, the tragedy here in Washington. 2 members of the Israeli embassy staff killed last night outside the Capitol Jewish Museum. The suspected gunman now charged with murder. We'll have more on that incident next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We will not tolerate this violence or hate in our city. We will not tolerate any acts of terrorism, and we're going to stand together as a community in the coming days and weeks to send a clear message that we will not tolerate anti-Semitism.
Washington, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser reacting to the murder of 2 Israeli embassy staffers, Yoram Lashinsky and Sarah Milgram, who were killed outside the Capitol Jewish Museum here in Washington last night by a gunman who chanted "Free Palestine." The attack was condemned as an anti-Semitic hate crime by officials, including by President Trump, with a press conference convening just a short time ago in which we learned the assailant has been charged with first-degree murder. For reaction here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, we turn now to Hadar Susskind, president and CEO of the New Jewish Narrative. He's here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio, having spoken at a memorial for the victims, really just not far from us earlier today. Hadar, we appreciate you being here on what is obviously a very difficult day. Just your reaction, please, to the events of last night.
Thank you. Obviously, first and foremost, just tragic, heartbreaking. I learned the news only this morning and was just shocked, and it's only become more shocking as the day developed. 2 young people about to be engaged, coming out of an event hosted by the American Jewish Committee at the Capitol Jewish Museum, My understanding is that they were not individually targeted. They were just targeted as people coming out of this building. I was not at that event, but I'm at many similar ones, and I know many people who were at that event. And it was sad and hit close to home.
There are a lot of questions about what this means, the fact that it's happened here in the United States. Yeah. But I'm curious what you're hearing from Israel and how it's playing there.
First of all, it's a very big story there. And I had this strange experience this morning of getting texts and calls and WhatsApp messages from many friends in Israel saying, "Are you okay? We heard about the attack." And for anybody who lives in one place and has friends in the other, it usually works the other way around. So people there are concerned. They obviously were concerned personally for people that they know, but also people are concerned about the global implications and the fact that this is taking what's a tragic conflict there and globalizing it even further.
Well, and we've spoken with you many times before here on Bloomberg about the conflict, about the plight of the Palestinians in Gaza, the kind of difficulty around all of this as this conflict is ongoing. What does it do to the people who are supportive of the Free Palestine movement to have this kind of violence now attached to that sentiment?
Look, this is horrible for everybody involved. Again, it is a tragedy. It doesn't help Palestinians in Gaza. It certainly doesn't help anybody who supports a free Palestine or justice for Israelis and Palestinians. This is murder. This is an act of terror, an anti-Semitic act. As I said, he was targeting Jews because they were coming out of a Jewish event. A lot of people, including Jews in America and including Israeli Jews, want to see an end to the war, want to see peace and a better future for Israeli children, for Palestinian children. This does nothing to help move us closer to that. And in fact, aside from the immediate tragedy of the loss of life of these two people, it only makes that more difficult because it hardens people's attitudes.
You mentioned the increased globalization of this crisis, but of course we're no strangers to anti-Semitism here in the United States. How should we as Americans be viewing this? Is this a new level or more of the same?
Unfortunately, it's more of the same. I mean, we've seen over the last few years a tremendous increase in anti-Semitic actions. Many people in America, who are in their 30s or 40s or 50s, grew up and lived lives here where anti-Semitism was not part of your day-to-day. It wasn't a regular experience. And now, unfortunately, for so many American Jews, it is. And we've seen in the past number of years more violence and more killing. The Tree of Life synagogue shooting, of course, Charlottesburg, where they were chanting, "Jews will not replace us." I mean, this is becoming a regular part of our disturbing, but regular part of our political discourse. And even today, we're seeing it on social media. There are people out there who are applauding this, who are saying, "Great."
Well, and obviously those are very difficult messages to see, especially on a day like today. I'm sure you were speaking a moment ago, Hadar, about how all of this is kind of unhelpful in terms of actually reaching some kind of resolution here, knowing that it also is this week that we have seen an increased Israeli incursion into Gaza. Netanyahu's stance around this war and eradicating Hamas seems to be hardening. Does that only add fuel to that?
Absolutely. I think the Israeli government, the ministers, the very right-wing ministers in that government have been, tweeting out condemning this attack, of course, as they could, but they've been blaming their left-wing Israeli, political colleagues for it, and they've been blaming people around the country who have been protesting the actions of the Israeli military in Gaza. And, as they are wont to do, they've said that, every criticism of Israel, every criticism of their action in their eyes is anti-Semitism. And so they are connecting that to this and calling it a result. So for those who want to see the war come to an end, who want to see Israel and Palestine be able to build together toward that better future, this is a step back no matter which side you come from.
Well, your sensitivity to both sides of this story and the nuances in which you talk about it are why we wanted to hear from you, Hadar. We appreciate your coming in.
Thank you.
That's Hadar Susskind, President CEO of the New Jewish Narrative, with us live on Bloomberg. And coming up, we're going to return to the developing news out of the Supreme Court a short time ago, saying the president for now does have the power to oust agency leaders. But up next, the recent selling in treasuries reflecting worries about the U.S.'s surging debt load as the House passes its tax bill. We'll discuss how the bill is impacting the bond market next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It's a reality. We're going to wake up one day and we're not going to have a market for our bonds. And if we do, it's going to be at a high interest rate, which is going to sink the markets. And banks are now beginning to slow up because they don't have confidence that we as politicians are going to make the hard choices. Every dollar in Washington, D.C. has got an advocate for it. But we've got to start saying no.
Republican Congressman Ralph Norman, Freedom Caucus member from South Carolina, talking with us last night on Balance of Power about the future of the bond market. And it is the bond market that will serve as the president's big hurdle if he wants his beautiful tax bill to pass the Senate, as 30-year Treasury yields respond to the House passage today. We're still above 5%. And for more, we turn to Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick. Romaine, they passed the bill this morning. So how much of this is now actually factored into the bond market?
A lot got factored in immediately. You saw a huge reaction in bond yields. They actually spiked in the overnight hours. A lot of people now starting to price in the idea of what the congressman was just talking about. They are potentially higher borrowing rates for the United States government because, of course, this bill does not really address any of the real deficit issues. And in fact, at least as it's written right now, coming out of the House, it would add to that. Now, we did see those yields fall later in the day here, but it's really not just about the day-to-day moves, Joe. It's really about the long-term trajectory. Remember, that 10-year yield you're looking at right now, 4.5% on the screen, that was below 3% not that long ago. Your 30-year yield was below 4% and is now above 5%. And that is the concern here. Remember, just a single percentage point, that may not sound like a lot, but that will add hundreds of billions of dollars to the cost to service the debt every year. And as the U.S. tries to sell more bonds in the coming weeks and months, they will continue to have to offer a higher yield on those bonds in order to get people to buy them. And I think that's the fear that you're hearing from some members of Congress, and you're certainly feeling it on Wall Street right now, as a lot of people want to see whether or not the senators who now have this bill in their lap are going to be willing to maybe address some of those deficit issues.
Well, and assuming that this bill can pass both chambers, Romaine, it's going to hike the debt ceiling. We're going to get a boatload of issuance as well that the market's going to have to take down.
And I really encourage our viewers to really look to that second week of June, because that's going to be the next big test for this Treasury market. Remember, we had a couple of auctions this week and last week where we did see investors really demand a much higher compensation to buy the Treasury debt. You have a big sale of 10-year notes and 30-year notes coming in about 2.5, 3 weeks' time that is really going to be the next big test. And everyone we've spoken to on this program today, and I want to just really highlight a comment from Greg Peters. He's basically the guy who runs kind of the fixed income over at PGIM. And he kind of talked about this is kind of two bond markets right now, a short-term bond market and a long-term bond market that have to be reconciled.
And Romaine Bostick covering them both for us here on Bloomberg. Thank you so much. We'll have more Balance of Power straight ahead right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The president is abiding by all conflict of interest laws that are applicable to the president. And I think everybody, the American public, believe it's absurd for anyone to insinuate that this president is profiting off of the presidency. This president was incredibly successful before giving it all up to serve our country publicly. And not only has he lost wealth, but he also almost lost his life. He has sacrificed a lot to be here.
White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt earlier today defending President Trump's crypto involvement in the face of conflict of interest criticism ahead of a dinner he's attending tonight at his private country club for buyers of his meme coin. Democratic lawmakers are demanding the identities of those attending. And joining us now for the details here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio is Bloomberg's Skylar Woodhouse. So, Skylar, we just heard from President Trump on Truth Social. He's heading to this dinner in a little while. He says the USA is dominating in crypto, Bitcoin, etc., and we are going to keep it that way. The problem is the concern that at least a lot of Democrats have is that the U.S. is dominating. The president gets to dominate, or at least companies affiliated with him by extension.
These dinners are very normal for Trump. He's always hosting dinners at his club at Mar-a-Lago. So, this dinner is sort of, it's nothing new, but it's definitely raising a lot of questions on sort of the idea behind the dinner and what it means for, this dinner to be hosted, the access that the attendees have to the president. Sort of buying for access is raising a lot of ethical concerns on, well, should folks be able to buy access to the president, and sort of what, deals, relationships are going to come out of this dinner.
Sort of quaint now thinking about the old Lincoln bedroom in the Clinton White House. Richard Blumenthal, the senator from Connecticut, called this an unprecedented pay-to-play scheme to provide access to the presidency to the highest bidder. What are these people actually getting? A photograph? Is it more than that?
Well, I'm sure they would like to snap some photographs while they're inside. I mean, they're sort of pitching this dinner as this VIP, moment, access. I think when we think of dinners like this, people just want that sort of elaborate, luxurious experience, and that is sort of what they're pitching here. And obviously, having the president there, the president of the United States, like the cherry on top. But it's definitely. Nothing new for the president to attend sort of these suave dinners, but it is definitely raising concerns on, okay, well, what does this mean ethically? And even from a national security perspective, like what sort of discussions are being had here?
We have questions. He calls it the most exclusive invitation in the world. Bloomberg's Skylar Woodhouse, thank you so much for the insights. For more on tonight's crypto dinner, the crypto space at large, and a lot of other developments today in Washington, we turn to Pat Toomey, the former Republican senator from Pennsylvania, is also a member, we should note, of the Coinbase Global Advisory Council. And Senator, it's good to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. I don't know if you have an issue with what the president is up to this evening, but do you worry, as a proponent of crypto yourself, that broadly this slows the turn to a new technology here because of concerns of conflict of interest and, in this case, the Trump family enriching itself?
Look, I think people are going to ask some legitimate questions about this, but I don't think it should, and I don't think it will detract from what's fundamental here. This is an amazing new technology. It is already taking off. The U.S. does dominate this space, but there's no guarantee we will in the future unless we pass sensible legislation that creates a regulatory framework. And what's really exciting is we're really close. The Senate has passed legislation out of committee. They've taken the first procedural steps on this, and I think very soon they're likely to pass this. And it's bipartisan. It's very thoughtful and sensible. It's been years in the making. And I think it's going to pass. I think some of these other issues will, kind of a sideshow. But the important thing is to embrace a really, really important and fascinating new technology.
Well, Senator, it's like you're reading our minds here, because we spoke with one of the spearheaders of that Genius Act in the U.S. Senate, Republican Senator Bill Hagerty of Tennessee, on this program last night. This is what he told us about the fate of that stablecoin legislation.
This is an opportunity to modernize our payment system, take us into the 21st century. We trade securities on an instantaneous basis. This would allow us to move currencies and payments at the same rate. It would be based on the U.S. dollar. That will extend dollar dominance around the world. My goal is to make certain that the stablecoin legislation passes and that we avoid a situation where it gets cluttered up or bogged down with a number of amendments that could be unrelated to this.
One of those amendments we're hearing rumors about, Senator, is that the Credit Card Competition Act could end up attached to this bill. Would that take its chances?
That would be a huge mistake. First of all, I'd strongly disagree with the substance of this so-called Credit Card Competition Act. It's ironic because there's just been a recent major new entrant as a practical matter in the credit card space with the merger between Capital One and Discover. But beside that, this isn't the place to have that fight. If it were to pass, it probably takes down the crypto bill. It has nothing to do with crypto. It just shouldn't be litigated here. Senator Hagerty is exactly right. There's a big bipartisan consensus on stablecoins. They are already in use. The adoption is going to really accelerate, and we should have sensible guardrails in place. That's what this legislation does. It should not get distracted with completely unrelated and very contentious issues that could jeopardize a really good and important bill.
I'd like to ask you about a stay that we received from the U.S. Supreme Court a short time ago that, in fact, allows President Trump to fire the heads of some federal agencies, at least for now, but shields the Federal Reserve, saying that it's uniquely structured, quasi-private, and Trump cannot fire the chair of the Federal Reserve, Jay Powell. You, of course, spent time as ranking member on the Senate Banking Committee. I don't know if you think this is appropriate at this point for Donald Trump to continue to threaten the chair of the Federal Reserve, but is he safe at this point?
I think he is. I think the president even indicated that Jay Powell's term expires next year. I think he will be able to serve out that term, as I think he should. I think there's an interesting test here. I am sympathetic to the idea of the unified executive, the fact that executive agencies should report to the President of the United States. The Constitution vests in him the powers of the executive branch. But take the case of the Federal Reserve and its management of our money supply. That's actually Congress's responsibility. Look at the Constitution. It's unambiguous. That's an authority that is given to Congress. Congress has created a Federal Reserve to execute that. It doesn't make sense to me that the president should be able to simply come in and dictate monetary policy. If anyone should, it would be Congress. I think the right resolution is for Chairman Powell to serve out his term, and then the process will play out. The president will be able to nominate someone. The Senate will have to confirm someone, and we'll have a successor to Chairman Powell.
We'd like to ask you as well, Senator, given your deep experience in the upper chamber, how you anticipate the U.S. Senate to alter the budget reconciliation legislation that just passed the House of Representatives this morning, knowing there are changes to Medicaid, there's a higher SALT cap, there is an escalated rollback of clean energy subsidies from the Inflation Reduction Act. What is most likely to get the chopping block in the Senate?
It's very, very hard to say. I don't mean to just punt on this, but it's just very hard to say. It's a different dynamic in the Senate. If you think about it, most Republican senators do not represent blue states, whereas a significant handful of House members do. There's less likely to be the focus on SALT, I think, as there might be on other issues. There are a group of Republican senators who feel strongly that we should be doing more to curb the rate of growth of spending. Spending is out of control. We've got a huge deficit problem. We've got a huge debt problem. Now, maybe some of the recent behavior in the bond market is a reflection on the bond market's views on this. I think it's complicated. I think there are other factors at play as well. Yeah. But there will definitely be senators who will be looking to curb spending more than the House bill does.
Well, does the Senate care what the House wants? Will it keep the SALT cap where it is?
I don't know for sure what the Senate will do. The Senate does care in the sense that the Senate can't ignore the fact that it's a very narrow margin in the House. So the Senate will proceed with this. There will be many voices advocating for different things. The Senate will come to the consensus that it can reach. But there's going to be constant communication back with Republican House members and leadership to make sure that this final product can get 51 votes in the Senate, 50 if that's all that's possible, and still get through the House. So it's a tough line to walk, but we've done this before. I think in the end the product will get to the president's desk.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. We're following several stories playing out in the courts that are impacting the administration tonight. First, a federal judge blocking President Trump's efforts to shutter the Education Department, including a plan to slash the workforce in half. District Judge Moen Jeon in Boston writing in a ruling today that the personnel cuts would, quote, likely cripple the department, ordering the administration reinstate employees to carry out duties required under U.S. law while instituting a preliminary injunction on the president's own executive order dismantling the department.
Meanwhile, the Supreme Court divided evenly in a major case over the separation of religion and government, thwarting an effort in Oklahoma to create the nation's first faith-based charter school. The 4-4 split does not set a nationwide precedent and leaves open the question of whether states with taxpayer-funded charter school programs are constitutionally required to incorporate religious institutions. The tie was a product of Justice Amy Coney Barrett's recusal.
And in a third case, a federal judge in California barring the administration from revoking the legal status of international students without doing an individualized review and following the criteria laid out in federal regulations.
Now, against that backdrop, the administration today escalating its month-long fight with Harvard University after the Department of Homeland Security today announced it cannot enroll international students, saying in a statement this action was due to the university's, quote, pro-terrorist conduct. This comes, of course, after the government froze billions of dollars in federal funding, escalating its fight with elite colleges. For the latest, we turn now to Bloomberg's Janet Lauren. Janet, the government says these students need to be transferred. Will this be held up in court before that happens?
It's hard to tell with so much that's been going on here. Students who are coming next year will at some point have to make a decision. Perhaps students decide they want to do a gap year just like they did during COVID when there was so much uncertainty.
Well, so when we consider the kind of legal question here, knowing this could end up in court, if Harvard is found to actually have to do this, does this have implications for other higher educational institutions, or will that depend on if the administration targets them as well?
The Homeland Security Secretary said today this should be a warning to other higher education institutions. Now, keep in mind, in her letter, she said Harvard has 72 hours to comply. She sent another letter in April demanding certain things, and she said Harvard did not provide what had been asked. They'd been given another chance, and now they have 72 hours to provide things like disciplinary records over the last 5 years of international students.
All right, this is a story we'll continue to follow, and Bloomberg's Janet Lauren will help us do that. Thank you so much for joining us. Coming up, we'll turn our conversation back to the one big, beautiful bill and what's in store for that legislation next as it heads to the U.S. Senate. We'll have more with our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
When the story is told of the 119th Congress, when the votes are ultimately cast on that first Tuesday in November next year, that this day may very well turn out to be the day that House Republicans lost control of the United States House of Representatives.
That was House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries on the floor of the chamber just after 6 a.m., moments before Republicans' massive tax and spending package passed in a narrow 215 to 214 vote. It now heads to the Senate, and for more on its future, we turn now to our political panel here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Caitlin Legacki, former Commerce Department official in the Biden administration and Democratic strategist, alongside Republican strategist Lanhee Chen, fellow in American Public Policy Studies at the Hoover Institution. Welcome to you both. Lanhee, the words of Speaker Jeffries there that this will be the day that the Republicans lost control of the House, knowing they did just vote to roll back Medicaid benefits for some individuals, to roll back subsidies from the Inflation Reduction Act that even red states stood to benefit from. Is there some truth in his statement?
I think it's going to depend on what the economy looks like when we get to next year. I think if the economy is performing well, Republicans will say, look, it's performing well because we got tax cuts, because we made these changes last year. If the economy is not doing well, then it's going to be a problem. Now, remember, going into a midterm cycle, it's not the president's first midterm cycle, but Republicans would likely stand to lose seats in the Congress anyway. So Republicans would have to work against history if they wanted to retain the majority. So it's going to be a tough push either way.
Democrats, in the meantime, already making ads about Medicare, about debt and deficits. What will be the sweet spot in that messaging campaign?
I think the line you're going to see in the ads over and over again is that House members, every House member cast the deciding vote because it passed by one vote to explode the deficit and cut your Medicare benefits or your Medicaid benefits in exchange for tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans. And you're going to see that a lot on TV from now until the election. And I think it's really going to drive a lot of voters. It's an effective message. It works, and it's true.
Well, but there's also no guarantee that what the House passed actually becomes the legislation that turns into law and is signed by President Trump. The U.S. Senate gets its chance next, Lanhee. How different is this package going to look like when it's done with its work?
I think it could look pretty different, right? You have the reconciliation rules that will drive some of what is likely includable in the bill. Now, Republicans could decide to ignore the parliamentarian. That would be precedent setting if they did that. But overall, this process procedurally has a lot more hang-ups in the Senate. And then you've got the fact that each individual senator has the ability to block action more than they did with individual members in the House. So I think this thing could look pretty different. I tend to think that the timeline on this may end up leaking. So the reality is we may be looking at the end of July, August, maybe even Labor Day before we have a resolution. And let's not forget the other factor is the debt ceiling.
Well, that's where we're going, because if that's the case, then Democrats might have to play a role in this. If the debt ceiling needs to be managed before this reconciliation plan can pass, it would be a separate effort. And now all of a sudden the Speaker of the House needs to work with Hakeem Jeffries. How's that going to go?
It's up to him. I think that the reality is that increasing the debt ceiling is one of the most important things that Congress does. And I think Democrats will take it seriously, but it does require the Speaker to acknowledge that Democrats have some leverage in this negotiation, and they have to get something in return for their votes.
As we consider the prospect of the debt ceiling not getting raised in time, that would assume that this legislation hits many roadblocks. Is the president able to strong-arm his way out of this? As he was able to make sure the votes in the House were wrangled today, can he do the same with the U.S. Senate, or are they not as supple?
It's a little tougher because the electoral dynamic in the Senate is not as dire as it is in the House. You know, I mean, you've got situations where members, if the president were to decide to campaign against an incumbent Republican member, that would be it for that incumbent member. In the Senate, you know, maybe the dynamics are a little bit different there. The margin's a little bigger for Republicans. There's a little bit more breathing room. Individual senators can have a little bit more play. But the president clearly has a tremendous amount of ability to influence the outcome and the direction and the way he wants it. And so I think at this point, it's going to be very interesting to see what people are beginning to lobby for, right? Are there provisions in the House bill that senators are going to begin to say, can't have this, can't have that? Right. How complicated will that get? The president at some point is going to have to put his foot down, I think.
So should SALT Republicans from New York and New Jersey be worried?
I would be. California is another state, right? I mean, I'd be very worried because there's not much of a constituency in the modern Republican Party aside from those that come from swing districts in the House where it's important.
Well, obviously, for now, President Trump is happy that the House at least was able to get this done. The president also, in about an hour, has plans tonight. He's attending a dinner with the biggest buyers of his Trump meme coin. A lot of Democrats raising conflict of interest questions here, Caitlin, but is anything really going to be done even if those conflicts exist?
No, I mean, I think at this point in time, the voters either believe that Donald Trump has conflicts of interest and he's corrupt, or they're totally fine with how he operates. There's not a lot of new activity here. I think it's deeply concerning activity, and I think any other president would be held under very serious scrutiny for doing it. But it's kind of how Trump operates. And so I think while Democrats are correct to raise concerns, we shouldn't let us distract us from the issues like Medicaid cuts, tax increases for the wealthiest, because we know that those really resonate much more with voters.
Well, Republicans just spent 4 years, at least many of them, describing how the Biden crime family, I think as it was known, enriched itself based on Joe Biden's power here in Washington. Democrats aren't going there with Trump?
Some of them might. I just think that if you are either trying to win a very narrow House majority or you are trying to pick up seats in the Senate, you really have to focus on what voters want you to talk about. And, you know, frequently with those attacks on Biden or other Democrats, it's projection. But at the end of the day, voters kind of know who Donald Trump is and how he operates.
Well, when we consider this crypto issue in particular, this is a live issue being dealt with in both chambers as they try to create legislation around stablecoins, around market structure. Do questions around the president's involvement make that effort actually harder?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think that on any given issue, historically, you've seen presidents have a point of view. How that point of view gets formed and shaped, you know, there are a lot of sort of discussions about that. But the reality is that the president is going to have a say, right? We have a system now where it's not just Congress going off to legislate. The president has a lot of say in what Congress does and doesn't do. So I tend to think that these discussions about the president's perspective on this, that, and the other, I think we're in a new era now. We're in an era where presidents do have a lot more authority, a lot more ability to influence the discussion, and a lot more agenda-setting power than they have previously.
Fascinating. What could happen in the months ahead? Caitlin, Legacki, and Lanhee Chen, we thank you so much for your insights and a great panel and invite you to check out the Washington Edition newsletter. You've got a lot to catch up on today. You'll find it on the terminal and online, Kaylee. It all goes back to 7:10 a.m.
Yep, when passage of that bill finally happened, and how much news did we get after from the Supreme Court to other things we're always following for you here in Washington. We'll do it all again tomorrow, so we'll see you then here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.